can discuss 3 questions on the government budget and the classification of the receipts, expenditure, and also the deficits in the government budget. So you look at these 3 questions. You see, question number 1, distinguish between debt creating and non-debt creating capital receipt. Question number 2 is define fiscal deficit. What are the large fiscal deficit indicate? And number 3, define primary deficit. What does the zero primary deficit indicate? What does the zero primary deficit indicate? So let us come to the first question. You see, distinguish between debt creating and non-debt creating capital receipt. You know that the receipts in the government budget, that is the government receipts or budget receipts are classified into 2, that is the revenue receipt and capital receipt. We are not talking about revenue receipt now. So let us concentrate on capital receipt. You also know that capital receipt is, what is the capital receipt? Capital receipt is that receipt which either increases the liability of the government or decreases the asset of the government. Now, on the basis of its effect on the government, this capital receipt may be classified as debt creating capital receipt and non-debt creating capital receipt. Now the question is, what is debt creating capital receipt? Any capital receipt which creates a debt, that is, which increases the liability of the government. Liability of what? Liability of repayment of the principal as well as the interest. So any capital receipt which creates a debt for the government is treated as debt creating capital receipt. On the other hand, what is non-debt creating capital receipt? You know that the capital receipt which decreases the asset of the government is treated as non-debt creating capital receipt. Why it is called non-debt creating? It is simply because it does not create any debt. It does not increase the liability of the government. So now we can easily distinguish between these two. Debt creating capital receipt is that receipt of the government which increases the liability of the government. Where, for example, the borrowings. When the government receives from borrowings, then it creates a debt for the government. It increases the liability of the government to pay back the principal amount of the borrowing and the interest thereof. So, borrowings is an example of debt creating capital receipt. On the other hand, non-debt creating capital receipt is that receipt which decreases the asset of the government. Take an example. When the government receives by selling its public sector unit, then the government loses an asset, though it is not creating any debt. So it is a non-debt creating capital receipt. Now come to the second question. The second question is, define fiscal deficit. What does the large fiscal deficit indicate? Here you see in this question there are 2 parts. In the first part you have to define the fiscal deficit, and in the second part you have to answer what does a large fiscal deficit indicate. Now, you see, how we define the fiscal deficit? The fiscal deficit is defined as fiscal deficit is defined as the difference between or the excess of total budget expenditure over total budget receipt except borrowing or excluding the borrowing. Thus, we say fiscal deficit is equal to total budget expenditure minus total budget receipt except borrowing. Now you know that the budget expenditure is divided or classified into two groups, the revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. So it can be written as, instead of total budget expenditure, you can write it as revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure. These two adds up to total budget expenditure minus the total budget receipt. Like expenditure is classified as revenue expenditure and capital expenditure, the budget receipts are also classified as revenue receipt and capital receipt. So here total budget receipt is equal to revenue receipt plus capital receipt except borrowing. Thus we find this. Now we see in a government budget, theoretically total budget expenditure and total budget receipt must be equal. Total budget expenditure and total budget receipt must be equal. That means revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure must be equal to revenue receipt and capital receipt. Thus, it follows that fiscal deficit amounts to, or fiscal deficit is the same as amount of borrowing. The fiscal deficit indicates the amount of borrowing. Now come to the second part of this question. The second part of this question is, what does a large fiscal deficit indicate? So from this you see, fiscal deficit indicates amount of borrowing. So large fiscal deficit indicates large amount of borrowing. Followed, so large fiscal deficit indicates a large amount of borrowing. That is, the government is required a large amount to borrow to fulfill the budget expenditure. So this is the answer to the second part of this second question. Now come to the third question. Define primary deficit. What does a zero primary deficit indicate? A zero primary deficit or a very low primary deficit indicate? So again, let us come to the definition of primary deficit. Primary deficit, let us write in short, primary deficit is defined as the excess of fiscal deficit over interest bearing. That is, primary deficit is equal to fiscal deficit minus interest bearing. Fiscal deficit minus interest bearing. Now we have already said what is fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is the amount of borrowing. Fiscal deficit indicates the amount of borrowing the government is required to fulfill its budget expenditure. And what is this interest payment? Interest payment is the payment of interest on the loans taken by the government in the previous years. Thus, primary deficit indicates required to make payments other than interest payment. So other than interest payment, what are the payments? The payments are like the expenditure of the government in the salary payment, etc. So if you come to this part, second part of this question, what does a zero primary deficit indicate? Zero primary deficit means, you see, you look at this, let us analyze this one. Primary deficit is 0, then primary deficit is equal to fiscal deficit minus interest payment. So if it is 0, then it means that fiscal deficit is equal to interest payment. Fiscal deficit is equal to interest payment. What is fiscal deficit? Fiscal deficit is nothing but the amount of borrowing required to fulfill budget expenditure. Thus, it shows that the government is required to borrow. The government is borrowing just to pay the interest on the previous loans. This indicates or this implies that government is not able to collect the revenue even for the payment of interest. Thus, a zero or low primary deficit indicates that the government is borrowing just to pay for the interest on previous loans. Clear? Now, after this, we shall come to next questions. Until then, thank you.